This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic 2 by Matthew J. DiStefano. Ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about faith? In Heretic 2, I dive into LGBTQ affirmation, rejecting divine violence, and embracing universalism in a bold post-Christian perspective. If you're done with outdated dogma and want a justice-oriented, inclusive view of spirituality, then this book is for you. Get Heretic 2 wherever books are sold, and start rethinking faith today.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? You've made it to another episode of the Unbelief Podcast. Today we have a special treat. My new book, How to Not Suck as a Christian, also has an audiobook, and I thought I'd give the listeners of the podcast a free sample of that audiobook, just a couple chapters, one on purity pledges, the other on atheists. So, purity pledges, no. Atheists, yes. Chapter 10. Stop asking kids to sign purity pledges. I was 14 years old when I promised God I would be a virgin. I was in middle school, and we had a general assembly in the gym from a, quote, sex educator that the Baptist church had paid for, who came to talk to us about the dangers of sex and why abstinence was the only way to avoid dying from AIDS. You know the talk. Has a little bit of science with a whole lot of fear and anxiety. One of the stories he told was of a person who met someone on the beach at spring break. I lived in a beach community. The person met a stranger on the beach, fell in love with them, and then eventually had sex with them. When spring break was over, they said goodbye outside the person's hotel room, and the one who was leaving slipped their new partner a note before getting into the car to go to the airport. After watching the car drive away, the person opened the note and read it. The note said, "I wanted you to know I had a great time, and also that you most likely have HIV. I was diagnosed recently. It was given to me by a stranger on vacation, and I wanted to return the favor. Welcome to your new life." This story was, of course, a complete fabrication and told to us as fact. And I'll be honest, it scared me to death. I mean, I wasn't quite sure how you would meet a stranger on the beach during spring break and convince them to have sex with you, but that was definitely out of the question at this point. Then, the speaker invited us to the Baptist church, which had sponsored his lovely trip to our school, for pizza and a true love waits talk where the girls might be able to get a free ring. I was always down for free pizza with a large helping of religious trauma. I talked to my friend who attended that church and went. There was pizza, as promised, some church games, and then the girls were sent to a room where they would be shamed about their body and how evil it was and how it was going to cause the boys in the other room to sin. They were given a script they would later tell themselves about how being assaulted or pushed beyond their comfort level was their fault, and they just needed to be more modest. In the boy room, we talked about how masturbation and pornography were a sin. We talked about how our bodies were meant to be strong and powerful, and we were told about how our physical strength echoed our relational strength and role to be the heads of the household someday. We were then taught about how our sexual desires were evil, how we should be afraid of our bodies and sexuality, and how God created us to be pure, and that meant never crossing the orgasm line, either by ourselves or with a girl. It was deeply traumatizing for a straight football player, but if you were not a muscular kid or not straight or basically anything other than their toxic masculine definition, it was even worse. Both groups were scared again with STIs and at the same time taught about how buying condoms was planning to sin. After all the guilt and fear, the boys were brought to a worship service with the girls. The band played emotional music. The pastor started talking about purity and being committed to our future spouses. Then we were invited to sign a purity pledge and leave it at the altar in commitment to God. For the girls, they would get a purity ring that they could give to their husbands on their wedding night. The guys didn't get a ring because of homophobia and the patriarchy. I wasn't sure why people were putting our purity pledges onto wooden stakes until the next day. And the local newspaper had a story about the True Love Waits campaign and showed a picture of the front of the church where they had staked all of our pledges on the front lawn. How I suck as a Christian. I was traumatized by this. But even as I dealt with my own scars around this, even after I was married, I was asked to lead a sex class as a youth pastor. I remember going to a giant ministry conference for youth pastors with a massive hall filled with curriculum vendors and proprietors of toxic charity trips from all over the world. I went from booth to booth looking for something other than the program I had experienced. I'd done some research and realized that signing purity pledges and getting purity rings were correlated with only one thing, and it wasn't a delayed age of first sexual encounter. The only correlation is that people who sign purity pledges as teens are less likely to use contraception during their first sexual encounter. I finally found one that was sort of choose your own adventure style curriculum. There were lots of options for how to experience the different lessons, and the title seemed to indicate it was a different approach. Good sex. I knew sex wasn't supposed to be good, but it worked. I bought it and took it to my church leadership, and they were squeamish about the title, but thought it was okay as long as I added one element. My class had to have a purity pledge and a purity ring. I didn't say anything. I was shocked and probably more than a little triggered. I went back to my office and looked at the research again. I paced back and forth, not knowing how I would get out of it. I returned to my boss's office and said I didn't want to do it. I told her about the research and how it didn't work. She pulled out a catalog of beautiful purity ring options. I pushed back ever so slightly, and she asked me to pick out a ring style. I sat in silence for a minute and asked what flexibility there was. She looked at me for a while and said that she didn't want us to encourage kids to have sex. The title was bad enough. I reiterated the data. She thought for a moment and asked if I would feel better if each student decided on their own promise. I said that might be better. She asked about the boys. What should we get them that was more masculine? A ring was probably not appropriate. I said they should all get a ring. She flipped in the catalog and said there were 2 more masculine options in the back, but we would find something. I caved. And then it got worse. We went through weeks of this curriculum and then had a celebration service where the students would make their promises privately on a piece of paper before God and receive their ring. When it came time for the purity ring portion, the pastor stood up and said, "All of these young people have made a pledge to God not to have sex until they are married." I was dying. He went on with more things that I couldn't hear because it felt like I was having a stroke. Then each of the kids went up. The ones I had promised that this wouldn't happen, the ones I had tried to chart a different course for. They walked up to the altar. They placed their cards with their promises about their bodies and sexuality on the altar and took the ring for which they had been measured 2 weeks before. And I said nothing. But I posted about this on TikTok. You never know when a TikTok video will get 10K, 100K, or a million plus views. But when I posted about my experience with the purity pledge signs in the yard, it was destined for 100K plus. Then one of the kids in the church I served years ago and received a ring DM'd me. They said, "Hey, didn't you do that purity ring stuff with us?" "Yeah, didn't work with me." They remembered. I was part of the problem. And to be completely honest, I died. Because the problem is so much bigger than a purity pledge or a ring or any of that. It is just the modern version of the demonization of the body and sexuality. Part of this has its source in the writings of Paul in the New Testament and in the Greco-Roman culture of the time. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul says, "Now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy. I think that in view of the impending crisis, it is good for you to remain as you are." Verses 25 to 26. And Paul doesn't stop there. He talks a lot about the desires of the flesh and makes the body out to be a real problem for us. This perspective on the body is very much part of the culture during the time in which Paul is writing. But to really understand Paul, you need a critical piece of information. Paul thought Jesus was returning in hours, not millennia. Because Paul had that as a core premise, anything that took time away from telling people about Jesus was a complete waste. Sex was a waste of time. Having kids was a waste of time. And marriage was a waste of time. As far as he was concerned, you needed to spend all your time either making money to support yourself or getting people to join this underground Jesus movement. He was dogmatically celibate and basically argued that the only people who should be married are those people that couldn't deal with celibacy. And once you got married, you didn't need to enjoy sex and should only use it to keep down your urges and mainly focus on creating babies. All of that comes from his being steeped in that Greek philosophical culture that taught that sexual desire was just a problem of our fleshly existence that had to be overcome. And that's why most Christians reject almost all of Paul's sexual ethics, because it doesn't work. It's just plain bad and psychologically unhealthy. That brings us back to an important theme we discussed in the LGBTQ chapter. Sex, marriage, dating, and everything in between are culturally defined. That's why you see a dramatic movement across the Bible in these areas. For example, multiple partners and wives are completely accepted in the Old Testament. By the time Paul speaks up, it's all about monogamy. You can't take sex advice from the Bible, or marriage advice really, unless you want the women to be treated as property. This is why the whole purity culture and promise ring thing doesn't work today. It runs completely contrary to the modern world's understanding of sex and sexuality. It is taking ancient culture, baptizing it as holy, and bringing it 2,000 years into the future to today. Our bodies are wonderful things to be enjoyed. This is the message of modern science and psychology. Our bodies are wonderful, diverse, and beautiful, each in its own way. There is no inherent shame in a body that is bigger or smaller, or has part of a leg that isn't formed in the most common way, or if it has hair or doesn't, or if it only has hair in certain places. Our bodies are beautiful if they have large boobs or no boobs. They are beautiful if our reproductive organs are big or small or have extra skin. It doesn't matter if our intimate areas are brown or pink or have a lot of hair or very little hair. Our skin is an amazingly enjoyable sensory organ that can fill us with delight and trigger the release of all kinds of endorphins and positive chemicals in our brains. Our skin can help us connect with the power of nature and feel the earth reaching up between our toes. Our bodies can transport us into an ecstatic state as we engage in sexual encounters by ourselves or with another person. It can produce a particular chemical during this beautiful experience that bonds us with the other who is becoming part of our world of intimacy and touch. This is not what I was told at church. but it should have been. If they wanted to place a boundary, it should have been this. No one can tell you what to do with your body except you. No one has the right to demand something of your body that you are not okay with. You have complete bodily autonomy. And if they needed one more boundary, that should follow from the first. You should never try to take bodily autonomy away from another person by force, coercion, violence, or any other means. You should use your body to bring more love, pleasure, and happiness into your world and the world of others. That's what Jesus modeled. Over and over again, when he encountered people whose bodily autonomy was being violated, he stepped in. He stood between the men holding stones and the woman about to be punished. He stepped in when he came upon people who were being shamed for their bodies. He spoke to the woman who had a bleeding condition that appeared like menstruation for years and said, "You are not evil. You are not strange. You are healed because you have been stronger than everyone else." My paraphrase, of course. That is how you don't suck as a Christian. You stop the purity pledges. You teach bodily autonomy and love of the body. Chapter 11. Respect atheists. They are doing okay. I walked up to a stage to deliver my weekly sermon. This time, I was standing in front of 300 to 500 people, and my first sentence made some of them gasp. I said, "I'm never 100% sure God exists. In fact, there have been many, many times where I was pretty sure God didn't exist." I expected their response. I gave them a couple of beats to let them recover, and I went into the story of Thomas, how he doubted, and all the information we discussed in the doubting chapter. After the service, a sweet gray-haired woman who sat in the same chair every week made a beeline for me. I thought she was going to tell me how dangerous it was to give people permission to doubt. That wasn't it. She leaned in, lowered her voice, and told me the family's secret. She had an atheist grandson. I knew what was coming next. She asked if I would be willing to have coffee with him. She said she didn't expect me to convert him, but that he has always talked about how Christians pretended not to doubt, and she thought it would be good for him to hear a pastor who doubted. A couple of weeks later, I was sitting on the porch of a coffee house across from her atheist grandson. He wasn't my first. When you're a pastor and you're open about your doubts, aunts and uncles and grandparents and parents set you up on blind atheist dates a lot. I knew what he would say after we exchanged the obligatory Southern pleasantries. Look, I'm not trying to convert to Christianity. I'm really fine being an atheist. This is the story of so many atheists I know. They are doing fine. And I responded, I get that. That's not what this is about. I just try to be here for people, you know? I wish I could say that I had always responded like that. How I suck as a Christian. When you grow up being told everyone who doesn't share a very narrow view of what it means to be a Christian is going to spend an eternity in some divine torture chamber, you see atheists in a different way. Or more accurately, you see them in two different ways. First, they are in immediate danger of the fires of hell. What if they died tonight? What if they drove away from the coffee shop and were hit by a drunk driver? Or what if they convinced a Christian to be an atheist? Atheists were dangerous not only to themselves, but to others, and they represented an existential threat to Christianity in general. When you add to that the statistical decline of the church, you have a crisis. That's why I was taught to either steer clear of them, which was the preferred option, or to make sure that every interaction I had with them was focused on saving them. And I did. But I chose a second option. I fought the dangerous atheists. I mean, the real bad ones, the ones with horns. I went into conversation armed to the teeth with evidence and pseudoscience and proof about the validity of the Bible and responses to every question I had ever heard. I would go over to the random atheists at lunch and strike up a conversation to get them engaged in a fight about God. But I didn't do this out of hate or spite. I honestly did it from a place of love. I was fighting to save their souls. I am a naturally empathic person and care deeply for people. When my preacher said to look at the world and imagine that all of them might burn in hell, my little teenage heart almost couldn't handle it. I looked around my school for so many days and thought about the spiritual warfare that was happening. I imagined the demons the pastor said were influencing people to cuss and drink and do drugs. My response was much more emotional than it was intellectual. I was afraid of them. And the more I knew someone, the more scared I was that they might suffer. So I fought like hell to make sure that didn't happen. Did it mean that I offended some people? Yes. Did it mean that I lost some friends? Yes. But that cost would have been worth it if I had saved just one teenager from that horrible fate. Luckily, I began to see holes in that approach by the end of my 9th grade year. By the time I was a senior in my Northwest Florida high school, I ran for student chaplain with a sign that quoted Martin Luther King. "Every man is someone because he's a child of God." I lost to a Southern Baptist. Atheists are doing fine. Back on the coffeehouse porch, the atheist grandson relaxed and said, "My grandma said you told a whole room of people at church that you didn't know if you believed in God." Yeah, I laughed, but they took it pretty well. I mean, they didn't fire me. Then we started into the questions. How do you stay a Christian when you're a skeptic? What about evolution? What about the people who die in accidents where they are young? How can you trust the Bible when there are so many errors? What about God basically committing genocide over and over again? And what in the hell is up with Noah's Ark? I had some answers. Some I didn't. He liked it when I said I wasn't sure or I knew options, but I hadn't chosen one yet. And I had questions he hadn't thought of about how the Bible was copied and changed. I wondered about why so many churches focused on the idea of tithing and on and on. He kept reminding me he wasn't interested in being a Christian. And I was okay with that. Because I have let go of the idea that it is somehow my job to convert the entire world to Christianity or to anything really. I don't try to convert the world to my candidate of choice or to iPhone or to a more contemplative practice of religion. I share information and what I've learned, and I let it go. A deeply mystical approach. I have decided that if God or the universe or whatever you want to call it needs someone to be a Christian or an iPhone devotee, God will need to make that happen. I can share my life and love and grace with people, but the convincing is up to God. I believe that part of God is the animating force in the universe. It's the thing that breathes life into lifeless things. The thing that makes water refract the sunlight into a particularly brilliant sky in Northern California. The thing that helps us comfort each other and feel like we aren't alone even when we are crying in the corner of our basement. And it's the force that calls to us to become more than we are. It's that animating, powerful, personal force that empowers us to achieve more than we ever imagined. It's that force that shows us when we have stepped out of line. And the very same force helps us apologize and move in a different direction. Call it the Holy Spirit or Gaia or whatever, but don't discount it. And don't think you can do one of its primary jobs, conversion. Conversion is an impossible task. It requires taking something that is of one substance and changing it into another. It requires not only a change of mind, but a change of behavior patterns. None of those are simple. None of those can be done by you. You can't convert anyone. So just stop with the atheist. I mean, don't ignore them or ostracize them, but learn from them. Let them ask you questions you don't know the answer to. Let them help you doubt. And then let them go and be themselves. So look, this kind of religious trauma can be difficult, either from the purity pledges or if you grew up as an atheist in an atheist family or are a person who's agnostic, but also, there's something spiritual going on in the world. We have this group called Not Church, and Not Church is exactly for people like us, like people who question, people who want data, and also people who want a community that's not telling them they're going to hell because they are, doing the wrong things or believing the wrong things. It's a beautiful community. I'll tell you, there was this whole conversation about people who use tarot to engage with the divine. And it's other conversation all about what's going on politically and how people are processing that in this spiritual way. It's really a wonderful, supportive community. I think you'd like it. And if you would be interested in trying that out, it's really easy. We don't ask you for 10% of your income, but it's $3. And, $3, try it out, $3 a month. And, it's one of those things. If it doesn't work for you, just stop paying. So I think you should check it out. It's called Not Church. And the way you sign up for it is you go to patreon.com/notchurch. Patreon.com/notchurch. We also have some fun merch like stickers that say, take the Bible seriously, not literally. You can find that at noomacommunity.com/merch. That's noomacommunity.com, Nooma, community.com/merch. And you know what? Wherever you're listening to this podcast, if you would leave us all the stars, and really, if you could take just a couple of minutes and put some text in there, like this podcast doesn't suck, or it doesn't suck as a Christian, that would be so great and so helpful. Thanks so much. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Patheos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place. Okay? We'll see you next time.